Well, good evening, everybody, and first of all, congratulations on enduring to the final session of a very long day of wonderful panels here at this great festival at Cliveden. We're immensely grateful to our team of organisers. My name's Jonathan Bate, and I'm chairing this session. I think I've been asked to chair it because I wrote a book, not this one, which I was talking about in the last session, but a book called How the Classics Made Shakespeare, which was about how the classics made Shakespeare. And the thing about the classics of ancient Greece and Rome is they have made so many writers, made such an influence on the culture of Europe and indeed the world. So we're here to talk about what is it about those cultures of ancient Greece and Rome that stays alive, why all roads lead to Rome. And we couldn't have four better people to talk about it than that. Daisy Dunn here is our professional classicist. She's written lives of Catullus, of Pliny the Elder, and most recently, this book, Not Far from Brideshead, which is about the charismatic Oxford classics dons of the period between the wars. Robert Harris needs no introduction. I described him earlier today as the Anthony Trollope of our time. He just can't stop writing. And he's an expert in almost every field of history. He's perhaps our best-known historical novelist. And among those historical novels, it's a wonderful reimagining of Pompeii at the time of the eruption of Vesuvius, which lines up with Daisy and her interest in Pliny, who was there. And then, of course, the trilogy of Roman novels based on the great orator Cicero, a remarkable trilogy of novels, and perhaps many of you, like me, had the privilege of seeing a dramatisation of them at the Royal Shakespeare Company. We then have Jessie Burton, and you might wonder why she's here, because you'd have expected her to be on a panel about the endurance of 17th century Amsterdam, because, of course, her million best-selling novel, The Miniaturist, and its various sequels are set in that world, although a world in itself that was much shaped by antiquity. But Jessie's most recent book is a young adult novel that tells the story of the Gorgon Medusa, a great story from classical myth, but from Medusa's point of view. And then, last but by no means least, all the way from Italy via Paris, where she's now living, we have Andrea Marcolongo, who's written two wonderful books about the endurance of the classics, The Ingenious Language, about the wonders of the Greek language, and then most recently, starting from scratch, The Life-Changing Lessons of Aeneas, both a wonderful scholarly introduction to Virgil's Aeneid, the greatest work of ancient Rome, but also a book that in some senses suggests that Aeneas can help us in our lives today. So there we are. Now, as I say, Andrea has written about the wonders of the Greek language, and I did do Greek up to O-level at school, and I found it pretty difficult, all those aorists and many different tenses and so on. And I would have to say that for many people, the memory of Latin, let alone Greek, in school is perhaps a bit of a nightmare. But for these four, it's obviously something that excited them, and they've stayed with it. So I want to begin by asking, perhaps begin with Daisy, what was it that fired your passion for the classics and has kept you going?
So talk about teachers, I think classics as a subject really moved on quite a lot by the time I was studying it, certainly from my parents' generation. And I had a fantastic teacher who was quite sort of outrageous. I guess she was probably only in her 50s at the time, but she seemed quite elderly to us, and it came as a complete surprise when she'd kind of come out with these totally disarming sentences, such as, when I was 24, I had the most beautiful breasts. And there's all be bolt upright listening, thinking, what's she going to say next? And then the story would go on, and she'd say, I'd be sitting in a bath, and one day the window cleaner came, and I suddenly see this man's face at my window, and he fell straight off his ladder. She said, and that is the perfect tense. I think some stories like that clearly stay with you for a long, long time, and I think having an energetic teacher like that really makes a big difference. And I think in my case, also my parents are both artists, and every single place we went to in the world, we were dragged around every single museum. I looked at lots of mosaics, I looked at amphitheatres, and I think all these things kind of gradually accumulate. They all go in and they build up an interest which develops over time. So I think that's probably the story of how I came to it.
And what about you, Robert? You didn't read classics at university.
No, I'm afraid I'm a total fraud. Although if I'd had a teacher who'd said I've got perfect breasts, my life might have taken an entirely different course. But I cannot imagine Mr. Vincent, my O-level Latin course, saying such a thing. So I'm a bit of a fraud. I only came to it really because I wanted to write a contemporary novel about America. Got stuck with it. I'd written a novel about if Germany had won the war, and then one about code breaking at Bletchley Park, and then one about Stalin. And I thought, well, I should write a novel about America next. Just, I don't know, what a strange thing to do. And I decided I would write a novel about what it would be like, a kind of fantasy dystopia if the Walt Disney Company had taken over the world. I went to Walt Disney World and I went to Celebration, Florida to try and write this kind of perfect dystopia. And I was checking into the Walt Disney World, the Grand Floridian Hotel, after several visits, and a couple came across the lobby, and he was wearing black tuxedo with black silk Mickey Mouse ears, and with him was a woman wearing a wedding dress, white silk, with white silk Mickey Mouse ears. And so I said to the receptionist, what's going on? And she said, oh, they're on their way to get married on the platform overlooking Sleeping Beauty's castle. So I said, does this happen very often? And she said, 8 times a day. So I thought, well, I can't satirize this. There's nothing I can bring to this that outstrips reality. Despondent, I returned home. It was the summer of 2000. There was a story in the Telegraph, new research on the destruction of Pompeii. And I suddenly thought, what if I made Pompeii my Celebration, Florida? And it wasn't quite such a hackneyed idea then as it became. So that's how I started. And I thought this was a crazy idea to write about ancient Rome, because how can one put oneself in the skin of people there? And I went to Pompeii, and I was walking through Pompeii, and I had that sensation of heat on my back. It was August, almost the anniversary of the eruption. And I could see Vesuvius ahead, and I could smell water drying on stone, that particular smell. And I thought, my God, I'm experiencing absolutely everything that someone would have felt then. So I thought, well, maybe I can do this. And I went in search of the source of the smell of drying water, and it was the aqueduct where it came into the town, and that was it. That gave me the whole story right then. So I came through it not through language, but very much through the idea of telling a story.
Thank you. Now, Jessie, what about you? What's taken you back from Amsterdam to Medusa?
Well, I think the first time I encountered the sort of adaptability of myth was actually a painting, landscape with the Fall of Icarus by Bruegel, that was then reattributed to one of his school. But I was about 14 and I saw that painting. I didn't have a classical education. I didn't have any Latin or Greek or anything like that. But what I did have was a kind of hunger for story. And that painting said so much to me. It's this beautiful seascape. There's ships and the sea is this kind of emerald green, and there's this lush landscape in the foreground with a farmer ploughing. And then just down at the bottom right corner, there's just this pair of legs in the sea, flailing as this boy drowns, and someone looking up, and out of the frame, you can't see it, it's probably Daedalus like watching, and I thought, I mean, I probably had an unconscious understanding of the power of the narrative there, and how exciting it could be to use these old stories, these old myths. And then the other one, my other entry in, was a similar time of my life, about 14, 15, Carol Ann Duffy's The World's Wife collection, Mrs. Icarus again, and it just taught me that these myths, these stories of gods and goddesses and humans with foibles are so strong that they can withstand utter reinterpretation and play. And that was really how I got into it. And then Bloomsbury Children approached me and asked if I'd be interested in writing for children, and I said absolutely. I've always wanted to do that, and my first one with them was The Restless Girls, which was the rewriting of a fairy tale. But the second I asked if I could do Medusa, because it seemed so obvious to me that it was a story or a myth that really deserved her side of it, because she very rarely appears in the classics other than a cipher for Perseus's heroism. So that was a good sort of bone for me to chew. That's how it all kind of started for me.
Yeah, well, thank you. And Andrea, what about you?
Well, I can't say that I encounter classics. It's Greek and Latin language that encountered me. I was 14 years old. I met them. I met Latin and Greek languages at the school bus stop. I was 14 years old, a little girl, born and grew up in Chianti, in the countryside near Florence. I really didn't know when I started the high school what Greek and Latin were. But I come from a country, Italy, where it's still quite common to study ancient languages at high school, and in a very serious way. So that's how I met classics. I really didn't know anything. In my family, I'm not from a family where classics were studied or really appreciated. I just encountered them at high school, and at the same time it was, when I say that in Italy they are seriously studied at high school, I mean it's something like a military boot camp. You can have to imagine a 14 years old girl or boy that really had to memorize something like 100 of Greek verbs day by day. So it's really, I still have nightmares, of course. But at the same time, I was experiencing something even harder than studying Greek and Latin. I mean, the teenage phase of my life. At the same time, I lost my mother, so really classic became for me a kind of landscape where I really can rest myself and my thought. Then I'm a strange person, so I decided to keep studying Greek and Latin at university. This was not that easy because everyone, like the sirens in Homer Odyssey, everyone would say, this is useless, you will never find a job. So this really required to stay really focused. And that's why at the age of nearly 30 years old, I really needed to write my first book about how beautiful ancient Greek and ancient languages are. How beautiful, how important. I mean, I'm here now, of course. I arrived today from Paris, and as I'm working now on a book about Parthenon marble and so on, I was feeling so honored to be in Lord Byron country. This is the most Philhellenic place I could be. This is the most Philhellenic panel I can attend. So here we are, and this is really the proof that classics are still alive.
Now, it's interesting that you've chosen Aeneas for your recent book. And Jessie was talking about the figure of Icarus and obviously Medusa. And in many ways, I think for many people now, the Roman poet who sort of seems most alive and most sexy is Ovid, because so many of those great mythical stories are in Ovid. And some people would think Aeneas, by comparison, is perhaps a little bit dull, and he's not very nice to Dido, Queen of Carthage. So tell us about why you believe that Aeneas is the figure for our time.
Yeah, thank you. But as I said, I come from Italy, and we all the Italian, we have a kind of complex. We feel less smart, brilliant, intelligent compared to ancient Greek. We were a province, and so we always have this impression that as we come from ancient Roman, we are not as pure and bright and I say intelligent as ancient Greek. So talking about Latin literature and the Aeneid, yes, we always say, when we studied it in Italy at high school, well, we always find that Aeneas is, yes, he is a hero, but less strong, smart. I mean, he is not that smart as Ulysses, is not that strong as Achilles, so we really don't find it so epic. And we always tend to consider Aeneid like a less epic poem, or not that adventurous like Homer, Odyssey, and Iliad. So, and me too. I was actually before deciding to write this book, I was even considering to write a book about something like, as my first book title was 9 Epic Reasons to Love Ancient Greek. I was thinking to write a book titled something like 9 Epic Reasons to Hate Virgil Aeneid. Because, I think that I never met a little boy who said, who can say, Aeneas is my favorite hero. So, I don't know, I was very polemic. Then I realized, unfortunately, and this is, during the lockdown, that the problem with Aeneid is not that it's not that interesting as Homer, Iliad and Odyssey. The problem is not the plot, it's not the main character, Aeneas. The problem is the timing, it's when we read it. If we read Aeneid during a peaceful, prosperous era or historical period, well, it's kind of useless, because when a thing goes very well, we don't need Aeneas lesson. We really need them. We tend, it's normal, it's natural. We want to look for adventure like Odyssey or to enjoy life, and we want to choose our adventure in Homer menu. But when things go wrong, even wrong, and our society experiences a really deep crisis, well, Aeneid is the poem needed, because it's really a poem that starts on a ruined civilization, the one of Troy, and then we follow the hero in his goal to reconstruct himself, rebuild himself, and rebuild a new civilization, the Roman one. So it's really the story of resilience, of resisting, of the courage. It's a story about the courage to give sense to pain, to tragedy, and to loss.
Yeah, well, thank you. In the previous session, the great psychotherapist Julia Samuel was talking about the importance of the process of loss and rebuilding, and in a way, that's what you find in the Aeneid. It is often the case that psychologists have been interested in the Gorgon Medusa. Freud famously said, Perseus cutting off her head, it must be to do with castration. I just wondered, Jessie, whether when you were researching your story, you sort of looked at some of those male interpretations and got angry about them.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the Hélène Cixous as well,
yes.
The Laugh of Medusa. Yeah, I mean, there wasn't much. I think the one thing I read was when Ovid described her as a young, beautiful girl, and I thought that was really interesting, because that was the first time I had heard of her as anything other than basically a symbol of rage and terror. And I kept thinking of the Caravaggio self-portrait where he presents himself as Medusa, that absolutely terrifying image with the snakes on a sort of Athena-shaped shield. And I felt that her rage was completely justified. She really didn't ask for anything that happened to her. And I just felt that for young readers, and both young women and men, because I also wanted to kind of handle Perseus's story a bit differently. He's not somebody who's necessarily enjoying this hero role in my version. But I think a lot of young women understand that double-edged sword, or the kind of impossibility of being objectified and praised for your physical attractiveness, and sometimes if you acknowledge it, then getting punished for being vain or being cut down to size, in Medusa's case, literally. And I wanted to I mean, I took imaginative liberties, but that's all
You
right.
certainly did.
You know, I know. At the end I did.
I particularly like, by the way, the bit where he pulled out his long, hard, double-edged sword and felt a bit uncomfortable about it, whereas Medusa was rather...
Well, in the text...
Sorry, I'm getting a bit
No,
Freud.
but in the text, she's watching him and he can't even lift it because he's 15 years old and this bloody sword that she's given him, he can't lift it, and it's pitiful. And it was so fun, and I feel that, you know, these stories, these myths are so flexible and open to interpretation. Another person who's a great inspiration to me is actually Madeline Miller, particularly her novel Circe, and that depth that she goes in to open it up. But it was so fun to kind of create a biography for Medusa. I knew she had two sisters who were fully Gorgon or fully immortal, but she wasn't. And then what was her life like before? What was the edge of night? I mean, I just read this line saying, I lived on the edge of night, and then I had to imagine what that looked like. Was it always moonlit? And then when she is punished by Athena, that moment of transformation and this horror of now being ugly and realizing she's being just as judged for that. And I gave all the snakes, not all of them, but some of them have names, and they respond to her and speak with her according to the mood that she's in. Because again, it's about, I suppose, in some ways understanding your physicality and accepting yourself for who you are, even if other people don't. And then my ending is different to the original, whatever. She does turn Perseus to stone, but she warns him several times not to come near because she has the pennies dropped that she is a danger, and he doesn't listen. And what is particularly gratifying to me with this book is the privilege of having them illustrated, and Olivia Lominette-Gill, who is an incredible fine artist. These paintings have been shrunk into the book, but they are enormous. And she has done these wonderful paintings, and there's one at the end where there's this stone statue of Perseus on a cliff edge, slowly gathering lichen and being sea salted as the three sisters fly away. And I'm sure it would probably upset some purists, but again, I question why the original whatever is actually so set in stone, because I feel that the way that we as novelists write the myths or use the myths in whatever generation we come along in often reflects the society we're in. And this book for me has actually been quite successful, so I think it's spoken to quite a lot of younger readers.
Yeah, and of course these myths, I mean, even in antiquity, sort of change all the time. I mean, the original Medusa story, her sex was consensual. By the time you get to Ovid, she's been raped. Now, Robert, when you started talking about you were going to write about modern America, I thought what you were going to say was that what you then thought was that you could write about this great period of ancient Rome, the Imperium, as a sort of allegory of empire that could be applied to modern America. But you didn't say that. But do you feel that in some ways what you were doing, I mean, you know, you're a man with a background in politics. You used to be a mate of Tony Blair until there was a little issue around one of your books. Perhaps you still are a mate of Tony Blair. I wonder if there's a sense that you were writing about contemporary politics, contemporary empires, whether American or not.
Well, yes, I think that I came to write about Pompeii just before 9/11, actually, and it was a sense of a great world power under that there was everything looked secure and safe. It was after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it looked like a great American imperium had arrived. And there was just a feeling, I just had a feeling that there was something would go wrong. So that was really how I came to write Pompeii. And as I was working on it, and the Twin Towers were attacked, and there were scenes which looked straight out of Pompeii. You remember the woman shrouded in dust emerging from the ruins. It was an eerie moment to be writing that novel. Then when I finished it, I thought I didn't really want to leave that world. I'd found it so interesting, and I thought I'd been a political journalist, and I wanted to write about politics in fictional form, but I was wary of inventing a prime minister or, you know, not least because even then it seemed to me the characters were so bizarre that to try and, you know, make a fictional version was redundant. And my God, now, well, one really wouldn't want to go anywhere near it. So, and Tom Holland's book about Rubicon, about the end of the Roman Republic, came out, and I thought, why don't I write to put it crudely, West Wing on the Tiber? Why don't I do a procedural about politics then, with these extraordinary characters, Cicero, Caesar, Crassus, Cato, Pompey, and so on, who all seem to me to be archetypes to some degree of political ambition. Cicero in particular, a very modern sensibility, really, you could say almost the world's first professional politician who came from nowhere and learnt the trade and mastered it. And so I set out, I realized it would be a trilogy of novels would be required, and I set out to try and write it as straight as I could. And where I think that trilogy works best is where I just let the ancient sources and Cicero's speeches and letters stand. And perhaps in the earlier volume I strained too much after parallels with Obama or Bush or with Blair, and actually I learned my lesson, because at the end, when the whole trilogy was finished, which I think was in 2015, yes, it took me nearly 10 years to do the whole thing. Then that was done, and then a couple of years later I realized what the whole novels had been about. They had been about unscrupulous billionaires in the currency of that time, seizing political power by appealing to the masses to undermine an elite of which they themselves were a part. It was a destabilization and a collapse in the end of the whole society, which ceased to function because it could not agree what the function of the Republic was. And that became mirrored in what was happening across the world, and the truth was there without me having to bring it out. And I think the great advantage of historical fiction generally, but particularly of the Roman era, is that it's all happened before actually, and that people have not changed that much, and that you see these patterns recur, and that's what drew me to that world.
Yeah, no, that is the fascination of history and historical fiction. Now, Daisy, I mean, historically, sort of thinking of Cicero there, from probably about the 16th century to the mid-20th century, it was chaps who were encouraged at school to sort of read Cicero so they could then become administrators, whether of the government or the empire. And we sort of think of classics as a sort of a chap's world. And in your recent book, the three main figures are chaps, and one of them, C. M. Bauer, the most colourful of them, very much liked chaps. So here's you as a woman writing about this predominantly male world. How did you confront that? And tell us a little bit about how women came into the story.
Well, I was very, very aware growing up that classics still seemed quite male. So in the 1990s, going up to university, I think there were still many more boys studying it, and they'd been doing Latin and Greek since they were 6 years old. I certainly hadn't had that sort of head start with it, and I was sort of aware, you go back to you yourself wrote on Shakespeare, and you kind of come across in The Merry Wives of Windsor, there's a whole sort of scene where people are mocking, a woman for really her inability to learn Latin, and you think actually at that time people did know Latin a lot more than they do today, so that whole thing's been really exaggerated and got sort of more and more out of hand as the centuries went by. And by the early 20th century, which was the period I was writing about, I think there was really a conscious effort on the part of women to push back against this and to try and even things out a little bit. One of the years in the book that I was writing about was 1920, which is when women were able to get degrees from Oxford for the first time, after a really long campaign to try to do that. And that sort of started to change things. You started to get more and more sort of female classicists coming in, and you get one of the dons I was writing about was Gilbert Murray. It was really trying to support women to study, who'd been teaching at Glasgow beforehand. He arrived at Oxford and he offered to teach women Greek pro bono. And they said, oh no, we don't want your charity. We want to learn Greek on exactly the same terms as the men. And I think you almost had to have within this women this real drive, this real hunger to learn it, because it was sort of denied women were denied the opportunity to study it for so long, and it was really uneven. One of the characters I was writing about was extraordinary woman, Elizabeth Longford. She was Elizabeth Harman at the time. She actually switched course. She wanted to study classics because it was seen to be a subversive thing to do. It was a male subject. She felt at the time that English was very much a women's subject. Classics was something that the boys did. So I think there was a real appetite among women, this realization that because classics had been forbidden from them for such a long time, to actually pursue it was to do something bold and extraordinary. And this is why I was sort of drawn to this period in the first place. You find women more and more trying to undo the status quo and put themselves at the fore, and steadily that does actually happen.
Yeah, no, that's and some of the most fascinating parts of the book are telling exactly those stories. Our sort of theme is the endurance, the influence of the classics, and of course, so many aspects of life in the West, from democracy to the theatre of tragedy and comedy to the Olympic Games, they all had their origins in ancient Greece. And so many of our political ideas come from ancient Rome, notions of republicanism and imperialism. Your latest book, Robert, is sort of going back to the interregnum, the Civil War period in Britain, and there was a tremendous sense of using the assassination of Julius Caesar and the end, the questions around the Republic and all that as a kind of model for the assassination of Charles I. So there's a real sense in which our Western culture has been shaped by the classics. But is there a sense now, as the world is more globalized and there's a lot of skepticism about some of the darker histories of European domination, is there a sense that the classics are now less relevant, or possibly indeed are instrumental in silencing voices that we ought to be listening to? Do any of you sort of feel as it were a little almost guilty about still being keen on Greece and Rome in our world? Who is somebody like Andrea would like to say?
No, I don't feel guilty at all. And yeah, I don't think that classic may be less relevant today. Otherwise, there won't be classics. I mean, this is the proof. And yes, I don't even think that. Classics are a kind of product of West civilization, and they can't. Classics is not about, are not subject related with, they are not a flag, a political flag or a geographical flag. Classics subject are people, and now Robert said I don't think that people have changed. We are still the same. Everything changed, even the climate. We ruined, but people are still the same. So if you really want to improve, people write, as Daisy was saying, it's not an old or ancient story. The battle of women battle to have access to Greek and classical study at university. I think that today, to defend, to improve classical study is really a political theme. For me, I took it very seriously because I think that the only way, not just to conserve classics and to put them in a nice museum and to honor them sometimes, is really to keep them alive as a way of integration of other country or culture, because not because they are our roots, as they say. It's not a nationalistic point of view. It's really like, this is my opinion, it's the most effective and most practice and safest way to understand human being. As I said, it's not a flag, it's not a Greek flag or Italian or Roman flag to defend. It's really this deep comprehension, this deep understanding of human being. It's really what we need today.
Daisy, Sorry, go on, Robert.
So I was just going to say that the essence of what happened in ancient Rome was that, or the Roman Republic, was that power was something a little like uranium or something incredibly radioactive that had to be split up and divided. And how did you prevent it destroying the state? How did you parcel it up? So you had 2 consuls elected annually. You had all the magistrates, or the senior magistrates, all elected. And then you had the tribunes elected. It was an incredibly vibrant, sort of constant round of politicking. And in many ways it did divide up power quite successfully. And that is a constant struggle of human beings, is how we arrange the distribution of power in our society. And I think there is something to be learned from ancient Rome. The scenes of the Capitol being stormed after the last presidential election, anyone who knows about the death of Claudius, for instance, will remember that his supporters burnt down the Senate, put his body in the building and set fire to it, and the whole thing collapsed. Again and again, you see these parallels, and so I think that it does repay study, and it doesn't matter which culture you come from. Power is power, whether it's in China or in Russia or in Britain or in Italy, and it repays study how these very wise people try to deal with it. And just the final thing I would say is, we should never look back with any kind of arrogance to the past, because arguably there were better political speeches made in ancient Rome. The architecture was brilliant, the poetry was brilliant, the philosophy was extraordinary. We have no right to feel superior to them. So to observe how they try to deal with these timeless problems, I think is highly instructive and humbling, and something we should do.
Well, no, I thought exactly the same as you. On January the 6th, I was in America watching it live, and you think, the building's called the Capitol. It's neo-Roman architecture, and there they were storming it. Yeah. But Daisy, you're very passionate about education in classics in your journalistic work, in your magazine editing, you talk in schools and so on. Do you ever get people saying, well, we can't listen to Aristotle anymore because he thought that women and slaves weren't proper human beings? Do you sometimes find yourself on the defensive? Or?
I think increasingly, actually, I think there has been a change. It's not so much that classics is useless and there's nothing valuable that it can teach us, but there's more a desire to open it up, and people want to know what's happening beyond Greece and Rome. They want to look at some of the provinces, they want to look at North Africa, they want to know what's happening in Asia Minor at that time. And I think classics has never just been Greece and Rome, it's never just been these 2 places, it's always been a lot broader than that. But people are asking more specific questions about wanting to know more about slaves, for example. That's something that comes up, and I think you're a lot more sensitive when you're writing about slavery in Rome today than you would have been sort of 10 years ago. And sort of, I think a lot of children in particular are coming at the subject through translation. They're not looking at it through Latin and Greek. And then some of the translations which exist are really, really old, and they sometimes give quite a contorted picture of what's actually in those texts, and they can give quite a false impression of what those ancient authors said. So I'll often get questions from younger people in particular as to what was actually the attitude towards women in this period. What would happen if you were a prostitute in ancient Greece? If you were a hetaira, were you really living a really glamorous lifestyle, or was it like a form of slavery?
Yeah. I mean, but then of course translation can wonderfully, revive the classics. I mean, the recent Emily Wilson translation of the Odyssey, I think the first time it's been translated by a woman, it's sort of wonderfully vibrant. Jessie, do you have a view on this?
Well, I was just thinking, I come at it from a very artistic place, I suppose. I'm just thinking about I think from where I sit, the things that sort of seem to endure and still seem to be relevant are in a more, commercial way. Or what are the stories that stick in people's minds? What are the things that they feel that they can identify with that can speak to their own lives? So in that sense, I do think that these stories, these myths, because I don't know that much about the speeches and the political setup, and I know a bit, but I think just being the person I am, the way I've been attracted to it, and I know other novelists too, just the sort of repurposing of these stories, really sort of led by someone like Madeleine in what she's done, do make them interesting and relevant to a contemporary audience, and therefore keeps them alive, because not everybody can read Greek and Latin, and not everyone will come at it from a scholarly point of view and sort of identify with what they see on Jan 6 with the ancients, and it's hard sometimes to remember that, because most people, don't get that much time to read, and if you get an opportunity to tell a story or retell it of Ariadne or Pandora, or sorry, I keep talking about Madeleine, she's got Persephone coming out as well, but it's really wonderful to see them revivified and not, changed beyond recognition. The strength of them means that their essence sort of remains, and their power. So I absolutely think that they'll carry on, and that they will find new audiences. But it's a bit like what Daisy said, people don't necessarily read the originals, so that's why Emily's translation of the Odyssey was so extraordinary, because she put it from a different angle.
Yeah.
And that's what translation can do, sensitive, intelligent approach to these the same words can shed a light where unconscious biases have closed it down in shadow.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course you don't always need the words. I mean, I was very struck as you were talking both about the sense of that sort of initial inspiration of the Icarus painting, and then the Caravaggio sort of helping you with your imagining of Medusa, because so much of Western art draws on those images. I mean, I just recently reviewed a big book about Arcadia, with lots of wonderful illustrations of representations of Arcadia in the visual arts. And this is something you've worked on as well, Daisy. And there's a sense in which the classics sort of give us a whole series of archetypes for living in the world. I mean, in the case of Arcadia, the notion of a place where we live in harmony with nature, which seems incredibly important today, not just a form of nostalgia. So, Daisy, you were telling me on the way in, just picking up on what you were saying about not just Greece and Rome, just tell us a little bit about your work in progress.
So at the moment I am writing a mammoth book on a sort of a new history of the ancient world, but I'm putting women at the forefront. And I think it's very clear, it's not a book about women, it's not a sort of chapter by chapter, so looking at this woman and this woman and this woman. It's more a book that you should read and feel that you're just reading a history, but women happen to be there. And what I've tried to do is go beyond sort of the geographical limits of Greece and Rome, and sort of draw in much sort of comparisons with Egypt and China, so a much broader sort of world history. And I think that's something that I think we're all a lot more sort of thinking globally today, and that kind of feels like it's a direction that we're moving in. And I feel like we should bring that to the past as well as we're writing about it.
Yeah. And Jessie, you've mentioned that your friend has written a number of these retellings, and if you did another one, which is the story that you think would really grab you, and you could do your modern take on?
I feel they've all been done recently. I'm a bit stumped. Yes. I think there's probably a few of us when we found out that Madeleine was doing Persephone, we were like, well, that's that one then. Yeah. Jonathan, I don't know, because I don't know, maybe something about Diana and Actaeon? Because there's an artist who's been here this weekend, Flora Juknovic, who's done a painting retelling, if you like, that story from a different point of view. I'm excited by the sort of transformations that humans turning into animals or whatever. Yeah. I find that could suit me. But I haven't sort of... Medusa was the one I was immediately just... I felt a connection, and I wanted to write this monologue. It's essentially a monologue, but I wanted to keep that sort of epic feel, but it's quite conversational, it's quite solicitous, you're inside her mind. And it's quite funny, it's not somber, because I think that's the risk as well, when you sort of start, and I resisted this a bit when I was doing the promotion, because it's about, a feminist retelling, and we're going to right the wrongs, and it can really shut people's ears down. And I just wanted to just, I guess, reposition the camera angles. So if I can find somebody else who wants to have her angles repositioned, I will. But at the moment, it was all Medusa, and even, you know, the story of Danae and Zeus, Perseus's parents. That was fun to sort of repicture. So anyway, we'll see. I haven't thought beyond Medusa.
Yeah. Now, Robert, your capacious historical imagination has taken you to many places, to the Dreyfus affair, and in your recent book to the end of the Civil War, the time of Charles II. If your imagination took you back to antiquity, is there a particular moment or set of characters who you think, I could do a Robert Harris on them?
Yes, I mean, I love the world so much. I would quite like to do another novel set there. I find the character of Augustus and his relationship with Agrippa quite interesting. I feel I'm rather prosaically interested in the power and I'm afraid, maleness probably therefore of the world.
That's right.
But I think that, it's such a mirror to our world, and yet at the same time one can have the pleasure of imagining that it must have been something like this. I think that that's the argument for the kind of historical fiction that I try to do. And I just sort of asked myself really rather prosaic questions, which is, how did you get elected? What was it like to address a Senate of 600 members? How did you talk to thousands of people in the forum without the benefit of amplification? How did the whole process work? What was election day like? It was and how were laws passed? And they got mired down in things like campaign finance reform. Really, and everything got mired and locked in the courts. Every election was being challenged. You don't have to strain for these parallels. They are all there, and it's just extraordinary to see the things that you think are so fresh and modern all happened thousands of years ago. And if you read the speeches, they are better speeches than are generally made today, I'm afraid.
Well, that is
not hard at all.
Excellent.
So I think that's the argument, perennial argument for doing it.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, we've got a little bit of time left for audience questions, and I can immediately see a hand there in the middle. There's going to be a roving mic on its way. So,
thank you. I run something called the Trojan Women Project, and what we do is we mount productions where refugees, for some time Syrian refugees, put their own stories in amongst the ancient text of Euripides' great anti-war tragedy, The Trojan Women. And when we had this first translated into Arabic, and the first cast was only women, purely by accident, they were the only ones who turned up to want to do it, and we did it in Jordan, and they were Syrian. They read the play, and they said, but this is us. This happened to us. I'm Hecuba, I used to be queen of my street, or I'm Andromache, or I'm Cassandra, I told them not to put their money in a house, it would be destroyed by the regime. What I'd like to ask you all is, what artist or writer or piece of work from the classical, whether Greek or Roman, did you come across that thing where you said, oh, that's me?
That's me.
That's not just, this might be like me at that time, that's me.
That's me. What a great question. Who wants to go first? Andrea, do you want to?
Well, this is a very great but difficult question. I don't know. I think, and I was thinking this while listening to this question, but I think that if I could say this is us, not this is only me, but this is us, this is our time, this is our society, I think that today, unfortunately, but fortunately at the same time, but it will be Aeneas and Aeneid. I mean, we are really, the West is really reconsidering, fortunately, himself. There are so many dangers, there are so many issues inside, politically talking, politically speaking, outside the war, the climate change. I think we are really obliged today, we are really forced, like Aeneas did, to take our culture and to help it to cross a metaphorical sea to build something new and something strong.
Thank you. Daisy, who are you?
I hate to say it, I think I'm Catullus. The first person I wrote about, I was attracted, that's sort of what drew me to write about Catullus, was the fact that particularly as a teenager, sort of falling in love, having sort of agony of unrequited love, so then turning sort of bitterly against that person that you had fallen in love with. All that emotion is just timeless, and I felt it very, very deeply, and I understood what he was grappling with when he was writing.
Udi et amo, I hate and I love.
Yeah.
Yes. Robert, who are you?
Oh, God. What a collection to pick from. Well, I did feel, when I read, I'm not comparing myself to him, of course, but I did feel a great feeling for Cicero, because I like politicians who are pragmatic, who are not fanatical or extreme, who want essentially to keep the show on the road, who are willing to change policies according to the times that they find themselves in. And I kind of, he said that the role of a statesman was to be like a doctor with the body politic and to try whatever cures were best for it. And he said that Caesar and Pompey never, ever looked at politics in this way. And I think that's completely true. And I admired his humanity. I mean, he was a boastful, tricky, duplicitous, but even those qualities I came to slightly admire, rather more than the psychopathic Caesar. Those are the kind of characters that I would wish to avoid in history, personally.
Jessie, I don't know if I'm allowed to ask if you see anything of yourself in Medusa.
Well, no, I mean, I've been thinking, and I think it probably would be her because, enough to compel me to write a book, definitely. I think it's because it's a sort of general experience of growing up as a young woman, and all my novels, I seem to be obsessed with writing young women on the cusp of adulthood. 18, 19-year-old girls often appear in my books. I feel it's a very powerful and yet quite perilous time in a girl's life. And, I feel I don't obviously over-identify with Medusa in the sense of what, but I think quite a lot of women have had a Poseidon in their life of varying degrees of severity. Most women understand that sense of scrutiny or discomfort or power being exerted or judgments being made on them, control taken from their own hands about their own destiny, all these sort of things that are often quite difficult to prove when you're asked to sort of provide the receipts. It's a sort of immanence that you move through as a young woman. And so it was a great not restitution for me to sort of really go into this detailed story of this girl's life and her transformation and her understanding of the way the world works and her trying to find a place to belong in that much more ambiguous space. But I wouldn't, if I didn't feel some kind of affinity and sympathy and hope for her, I don't think I would have written the book.
No, thank you. Let's take another question. Just down here at the front, and then one at the back. We've probably got time for two more, so we'll take that one first.
Hi, I've been absolutely fascinated by everything you've all been saying. The unconscious bias of translation is intriguing. Equally, the extent to which figures through history have been misinterpreted. Which figures spring to mind? One that springs to my mind, for example, is Theodora, the prostitute turned empress, and the myth around her, debatably, the extent to which she was a prostitute and no more. Which characters come to your mind as having been distorted by history or translation?
I suspect this is one for Daisy, perhaps, since you're surveying the entire ancient world. Who have you found to
I think you make a really interesting point. I think so many women have been written off as prostitute. The word prostitute is applied to women a lot of the time in translation when that isn't actually there. Theodora's one, Aspasia is another one.
Aspasia's very good one.
And in her own time as well, there were lots of jokes that comedians were making in the theatre saying, oh, she's a madam, she's pimping, she's findings of women for Pericles. all these lies were sort of bandied around, but then you also get the other side of the story where she was actually a skilled teacher of rhetoric, and she made fantastic speeches, and Socrates learned to write fantastic speeches because of her. And so you have to sort of take one bit of her away from all this other stuff, which has clearly been made up a lot of the time. And this is really sad, I think, when you read about women in the ancient world. Repeatedly, you find these labels being attached to them really without any kind of evidence for it. So I think Aspasia really sticks out in my mind.
And of course, so often there's the problem that the lives of these figures are written long after they have lived and are sort of semi-mythical.
It's not always, I mean, sometimes it's kind of an accident. I mean, the fact that hetairae, there's a certain sort of class of prostitutes in Greece, they were pretty much the only women who were allowed to converse with men and have a voice. So sometimes if a woman was vocal, it was natural to think, oh, well, she must be a prostitute, because most women were denied an opportunity to even say anything. So you can kind of see where it came from. It's not just malicious, it's sort of assumption based on the norm.
Let's take that question at the back.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Just, my question is, I'd like you to imagine that I was a 17-year-old student about to start university. None of these people that you've talked about do I have a clue about. There's a possibility to study the classics, as the title of this talk is, the timeless classics. And I say to you, I could take a class, not a whole degree, just a class in the classics. Why should I study the classics? What lessons will I learn today that are relevant, that I can apply to my life, or that will inspire me?
Well, that's a great question to end with. I'll give the panel a moment to think of their answers. I'll give my answer, which is an answer I sometimes give to students, which is I say you should get A.D. Melville's World's Classics translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, because in those stories, they're funny, they're sad, they teach you everything about the sheer variety of human life. Everything is there, from transgender to environmental issues to questions of falling in love, falling out of love, getting angry, relationships of parents and children, relationships between us and some other world. That is a world that will help you to understand our world, but also, as we've been hearing, because so many of these stories have been retold and are at the basis of art, and that Shakespeare is full of references to them, it'll also give you a kind of dictionary and equipment for understanding the rest of culture. So that's my answer, but let's hear from the panel. Andrea.
Yes, this is a beautiful question. I would say that you won't learn anything but yourself. I mean, classics are not there, they don't to teach us something. They are not a religion, they are nor a manual. Actually, classics exist to allow us to define ourselves according or against them. So, as I said, they are not a religion, or they are not there just to be honored, or I need a lesson. Of course, there are thousands and thousands of lessons, but I think that the most amazing discovery will be your truly self.
Help you to know yourself, yeah, Jessie.
Well, I mean, I would say probably you don't have to, at 17, treat them with that reverence that sometimes is expected of them. And if you don't, you might one day find some good ideas in there. If you wanted to become a novelist, it could be quite helpful down the line. Yeah, I think it's sort of, I understand the question, and I don't have I'm not going to be able to sit here and give a sort of a lauded answer, but yeah, it's about, you just never know. Yeah. They might come up in a pub quiz question, Go home with 50 quid in your pocket.
But you've sort of answered it in relation to a political sort of paradigm, as it were. Anything you want to add?
For me, I think that some of Cicero's letters are wonderful to read. The humanity of them, the freshness of them, the humour of them, actually. There's one which was Gore Vidal's favourite letter of Cicero's, where he, it was when Caesar, not long before Caesar was assassinated, when he was at the height of his pomp, and he was touring southern Italy, and he invited himself to dinner at Cicero's house, and Cicero described the event to his friend Atticus. So he said, well, of course, I'll entertain him. But he turned up with more than 1,000 men who also had to be fed. So he said, well, we did the best we could. We took over these various houses. We had a pleasant discourse. We talked about philosophy. And in short, I showed him that I knew how to live. And he said it passed off very well. But he's not the kind of man to whom you'd say, do drop by the next time you're in the neighbourhood. And that is literally, I think, the translation of what he wrote. And it is just a joke that over 2,000 years still reaches out to you. And I would use that.
It's got good jokes, and Catullus has got good sex. Well, is there anything else you want to add, Daisy?
I can't think of anywhere else where you have the opportunity to really get to know someone who lived 2,000 years before you. You know, this is a subject where you can sit down and really almost have a sort of meeting of minds with someone who's almost impossibly old. You can get to know sort of what they were thinking, what they were saying, who they were hanging around with. And that to me just feels really special.
Fantastic. Okay, well, all our authors will be signing their books in the John Sando tent. But before we go over there, please join me in thanking these four wonderful panelists.